are going to start the day with definitions so that we all have an idea of what we're talking about. Oh, look, I've already gone to it. Didn't even mean to. All right, see, already we're learning. So we're starting off with your classic addiction, which simply means compulsive behavior. And it's characterized, as you all know, by the inability to not do it. Now, we're going to talk a lot about this today because there are ways to look at it from the psychoanalytic point of view, and there are ways to look at it from the addictions point of view. When I'm working with clients and I'm talking with them about addictions and I see that knee-jerk kind of no, I don't have an addiction, I very quickly change my vocabulary to obsessive-compulsive traits. Because as we all know, those who have addictions have obsessive and compulsive traits. The obsessive piece is, of course, the inability not to think about it, thinking about it, ruminating about it, planning it, and then the compulsive piece is actually engaging in the behavior and not being willing to stop it, or not being able to stop it, experiencing themselves as unable to stop it. So when I'm talking about addictions, I'm also talking about obsessive and compulsive behaviors. Process, this is what is important here. When we're talking about the process addictions, we're really talking about what goes on in the mind, which is really not much different than what goes on in the mind of an alcoholic or a drug addict, right? That they're spending an awful lot of time thinking about it. And we all know that when an individual is using drugs and alcohol, the drugs and alcohol are the final symptom. But the symptoms that come before the drugs and alcohol are the thought processes, the automatic thoughts, the beliefs about themselves, the existential discomforts that they want to anesthetize themselves from, etc., etc. With a process addiction, what we're talking about is not imbibing a drug or a substance. No alcohol, no drugs necessarily. We're going to, as we get further into the day, I'm going to be talking an awful lot about the cocktail of neurotransmitters and hormones that builds into process addictions. All right. Did this work? There we go. We're also talking about the compulsive need that is met by psychological characterized by tolerance and psychological symptoms upon withdrawal. So just as with drugs and alcohol, we have withdrawal when individuals are not able to engage in their process addictions. And this is something that often surprises people because they say, you know, well, we don't have any poisons being introduced into the system, right? We don't have any prescription drugs, we don't have alcohol, we don't have any of those things. But when you have a cocktail of neurotransmitters and hormones, just as you would when a client begins to wean off of medications, they will have reactions sometimes if the weaning goes too fast. Or if they stop their serotonin reuptake inhibitors cold, they will have withdrawal symptoms. It isn't much different than what happens to an individual who has a process addiction. And we'll talk about that. Okay. These are some of the addictions we're going to cover. And again, with addiction, we're also, as I said, we're using obsessive and compulsive disorders. Many insurance companies will not pay for addictions, but they will pay for obsessive-compulsive disorders. All of these fit into that criteria. With work addiction, we've got the compulsive use of work. How many people work with people who work compulsively? Anybody have clients who complain about being too busy? And they'll say to you, well, you know, once this project wraps up, I'll have a lot more time to do that. Well, I've got 15 projects on my plate. I just wish I had more time. And when you problem solve with them to manage their calendar, because all of us fall into that phase, it is part of treatment sometimes. Let's look at your calendar. What can you do to create space for yourself? And they can't find it. Start thinking work addiction. We'll talk about that at the end of the day. Sex addiction falls into so many categories. We've done a workshop on this one. It's an entire day or 3 to talk about sex addiction and everything that goes into it. Today we're going to focus on sex addiction. We're also going to focus on cyber sex addiction and a little bit on how the family is affected by it, because you're going to see family members of sex addicts way before you're going to see the sex addict. And one of the ways, I like to refer to them as the canaries in the mine, the family members. And so when a family member comes in and they're clearly going canary on us, start thinking about what's happening in the family system, and often you're going to find that you've got a sex addiction going on, a lust addiction, and or a cyber sex addiction. The reason for lust being in the definitions phase is because the 12-step programs that work with sex addiction focus on lust as the drug of choice. And again, lust carries with it neurotransmitters, hormones, adrenaline, et cetera, which is again why we're going to be talking about it that way throughout the day. we'll just go forward. Romance addiction. Throughout the day, we're also going to touch on codependence, romance addiction, relationship addiction. They look the same. They also look like borderline personality disorder. So we're going to do some differential diagnosis in terms of what makes a personality disorder, what makes a compulsive set of behaviors. Where does fantasy play into this? How does fantasy as the drug of choice impact the individual and their family system and the people around them? Limerence is one of my favorite words in the world. I think it's lovely, limerence. It just kind of brings up, nobody ever really knows what it means when I use it. It doesn't have any tags to anything else we ever think about. Limerence. It's the state of infatuation. It's simply the state of infatuation, which means there's a shift in dopamine, there's a shift in serotonin, and there are hormones being released. That's really all it means with limerence. When you fall in love with someone, the first 6 weeks is limerence. And that's when people are engaged in the physicality of love, the infatuation piece. And frankly, it's that primal urge that we have to procreate that makes up limerence. When we're experiencing limerence towards someone, we are trying to fulfill that primeval job of ours to keep the race going, the human population going. And when it lasts 6 weeks long, that's when you know it. Think about any time you've ever been in love with someone, it lasts 6 weeks, the intensive pink cloud phase, and then you start to really get into being with that person in week 7, which is why, depending on who you work with, you're going to have some people who will go through serial relationships and they'll last, 4 to 6 weeks, 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 red flag right there. You've got someone who's really comfortable in limerence, not comfortable when it moves out of limerence. So start thinking possible process addiction, possible romance addiction. Okay. Relationship addiction, which is different from the use of limerence and all. Whoops. Okay. This one brings everything into the picture. It brings in the idea of the relationship being important, sex being important, limerence is important. They're always trying to get back to those magical first few days of the relationship. But the point of the relationship addiction issue is to manage intense emotional states. Addiction is about anesthesia. It is about mood management. It's that basic. All right, codependence, we're all familiar with this, or at least most people are. The use of others to manage intense emotional states. I need to manage chaos. If I manage you, the chaos in my life will decrease and I'll be okay. So codependence can sometimes come on its own. It's simply, the individual simply has it and engages in relationships in a codependent manner. Sometimes codependence comes through co-addiction. Co-addiction comes in 2 forms. The first form is, I'm the spouse of an addict, and as I live with my addict over a period of time, I begin to compulsively enable, I begin to obsess, I begin to engage in my drugs of choice in order to manage my spouse or my partner. The other kind is simply a fellow addict who joins up with another addict. What this can mean is the individual can be codependent, which is a form of process addiction, and that can move right into co-addiction. We're going to talk about this throughout the day. Food addiction is the compulsive use or lack of food. How many people work with food addicts, anorexics, bulimics, binge eaters, clients who are dramatically overweight? Okay. Spending addiction, we're not really going to talk an awful lot about that one today. That one's going to be woven throughout. But spending addiction is simply a process addiction that people are aware of. And in fact, there are many commercials about spendaholics, going to find their sales. I often find that when the spouse of an addict is not fitting into any other categories, and she will be shopping. So for example, yesterday I had a client who came in complaining about how busy her schedule was, and the Christmas season was just overwhelming. And I said, well, she said, and I just had a day. It was a lot less busy than my other days, but it was really, really busy. And I said, well, tell me what, just give me a flavor of your day. And she'd gone to 5 different department stores in a 3-hour period before seeing me, and then she was going to see me, and then she was going to go have a lunch with a friend, and then she was scheduled to go to 8 more stores in the afternoon before getting home by 3:30 to meet her child at the bus. And I asked her how many people she had to buy for, and she said, well, I only have about 55 people that I'm buying Christmas presents for. Okay? Not best friends, not close people, but she just needed to buy something. And as we explored this, as she got further into it, she began to say things like, well, I'm really relieved when Christmas comes because then I have something to buy. I have a reason to buy. And it's no longer ending up in my closet with the tags on. And she began to talk about going through the closets for a donation, because this is the time of year that people begin to donate things that are gently used. And she told me that she had donated 3 bags of items that the tags had not been removed from. And I thought, oh, I'm really glad this happened today, because now I know a new thing to work on. I knew there was a compulsion in there, I just didn't know what it was. And now I know at least one compulsion that she's got that we can work on. Pathological gambling, the compulsive use of money in gambling. And as with all other addictions, the purpose of it is to manage intense emotions, anesthesia, existential concerns. How do I make it through my day? How do I make it through my day without being too intimate, without dealing with too much, because I'm overwhelmed by that? It's all about affect regulation. Now, for differential diagnosis purposes, personality disorders are different from addictions. I like to say to people, do not diagnose a personality disorder until an individual, and this is of course a utopian statement, has worked through step 4 and 5 of a 12-step program. Because until the person has worked through step 4 or step 5 and begins to take responsibility for their behavior, they look personality disordered. Now, we don't always have the luxury of being able to wait and see, but as an individual works through treatment and they work through a 12-step program, and again, we're lucky if they work through a 12-step program while they're doing treatment, as they become accountable and then they become responsible, they will look less and less personality disordered, because personality disordered individuals are profoundly immature. Profoundly immature. And they will act as a group quickly, impulsively, deeply, and in a toxic manner to manage their internal state. Well, how is that different from an addict? It's not much different from an addict, except that what we know is when an individual has a personality disorder, those symptoms and traits are not necessarily managed by a 12-step program, and they're not necessarily managed by treatment. People will blow out of treatment sooner than they'll manage their personality disordered issues. So we're going to talk about that an awful lot.